All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Mike in New Haven podcast. It is episode 68, 68 episodes into this podcast. It's hard to believe. We've definitely been on a roll since the podcast returned last December after a hiatus. We've gotten a lot of great guests from many different fields: news, sports, the fire service, law enforcement, throughout the time that we've been doing the show. And another great guest coming up today. If you haven't checked out my last episode 67, check it out. It was with former NYPD Chief of Department Louisiana Moan, as him and I spoke for about an hour or so on just his great career in law enforcement, emphasis on community policing in the 90s, the implementation of the CompStat program that helped drive crime down in the 90s in New York. He was a really fascinating guy to talk to. So from law enforcement in episode 67 to sports in episode 68 with my next guest, who was a repeat offender. He was on way back in episode 10 during the early stages of this show. So he's making his triumphant return 3 years later today, highly regarded as one of the premier basketball writers in the sport. He's been covering the NBA since 1997, at least on a major level, with bylines and publications such as the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, Bleacher Report, and currently Sports Illustrated. Howard Beck has returned, and he joins me now on the Mike and Even podcast. Howard, as Zach Lowe always introduced you, and the late, great Kobe Bryant as well. What up, Beck? Welcome. How are you?
What up, Mike? Thank you for that very nice introduction. It's great to see you again. I have to make one small adjustment, but this happens all the time, so don't feel bad. LA Daily News, not the LA Times.
Oh, okay. My bad.
But it's easy mistake to make because a lot of people, especially outside of LA, unfortunately, actually even in LA, might only know of the LA Times. The LA Daily News, the smaller of the two and oft overlooked. But I'm proud of my time there, so I gotta definitely make sure to get them out there.
No, I appreciate you making that correction. It's kind of like in New York to an extent with the New York Times and the New York Daily News, although they both get an equal amount of attention. I would say the one that has more prestige would be the Times over the News. So sometimes the news gets overlooked in the city. So I appreciate you making that correction. No problem. So let's begin with the question that I ask all of my guests, and that's let's focus on your earlier. So if I'm not mistaken, you're a native of the Bay Area, born in Oakland, if I'm not mistaken, that's correct? Or at least around the Oakland area?
Yes. Correct.
And you grew up
born in Oakland, but raised mostly San Jose.
I was going to say, yeah, you grew up in San Jose, played some soccer as a kid. Ironically enough, you grew up as pretty much the only sports fan in your family. So elaborate further on those early years.
Yeah, no, you went deep on the research there. Yeah, so I'm middle child of three boys, and I'm not going to profess that I was some great athlete, but compared to my brothers, I was an Olympian, frankly. So we just weren't a very big sports family. And so it's actually strange that I ended up down the path that I did, just in terms of my passion for sports and then writing about sports, because not only did my brothers and my parents weren't very big participants, they weren't fans either. My dad, when I really got into like the Niners, I was a huge Niners fan in the 80s. And my dad would watch some football with me. We had baseball on occasionally. If there was I remember we had this deal through the school sometimes where students could get discounted like Giants tickets. So we went to like Candlestick or whatever. So my parents did go to sporting events with me, but it was not a family thing. It was not a priority. I don't even actually remember going to anything with all five of us, unless maybe it was like the earliest version of the San Jose Earthquakes soccer team, which was the only thing in San Jose that we had to call our own back then. This is long before the Sharks came into being. So maybe because like Earthquakes tickets would have been really, really cheap down at like, Spartan Stadium, but that's it. So yeah, I played, youth soccer for maybe 3 years. I ran track and cross country starting in junior high and through most of high school. Had 1 year of like YBA basketball. And then everything else was just like pick up and like, touch football in the street, trying not to, fall over and like scrape yourself to death on asphalt.
Yeah.
Tackle football with friends on the grass, all the usual stuff that kids play, some softball here, I had a couple of years of Little League baseball. I wasn't great at any of it. I was a decent runner. That's certainly my best sport was running, cross country, and track. My claim to fame, if there is one, would be that I did once run a 5:20 in the mile as a junior in high school. And then my senior year, I remember what I had, pneumonia or just a bad flu, something messed up my senior year track season. But anyway, that was it. There's my athletic upbringing, but mostly I am where I am in terms of covering sports because of my passion as a fan. And that was driven almost entirely by the Niners, not the Warriors, who were terrible for most of my upbringing. I watched a little of everything, but football was actually my biggest sport as a fan.
So you picked a great time to be a Niners fan. It's kind of like becoming a Yankees fan during the late 90s, when they had that great dynastic run of 4 titles in 5 years, because the Niners of the 80s, and of course they won one Super Bowl in the 90s with Steve Young, but the Niners of the 80s with Joe Montana and Jerry Rice and so many different great players. I mean, it was really one of the greatest shows in sports, and you were front and center for it. So I guess I'll ask, what hooked you on the Niners? Was it Montana? Was it Rice? Was it a combination of things?
Yeah, I can literally trace my career back to a single moment, and that's the catch. Yes. Joe Montana to Dwight Clark in the 1982 NFC Championship game. If I think about how I ended up where I am, okay, I'm covering sports for a living, basketball in particular, but and I spent several years covering news. I was in, I had departed sports for a while earlier in my career, but when I first went to college at UC Davis, I went to work at the college paper immediately. There's no journalism program there. It was completely student-run paper, which actually was great for a lot of reasons, I think. But I went in and on day one said, I want to be a sports writer. Like that was my goal getting to college. I want to be a sports writer. I'm going to go work for the college paper. I'm going to figure it out from there. But the reason I wanted to do that was because I had spent the last however many years devouring the San Jose Mercury News sports section. And I was doing that primarily because of the Niners. And I was a Niners fan primarily because like the most like mind exploding sports moment of my youth to that point, or of my life to that point, was Montana to Clark, the catch. The Niners were going to lose that game to the Dallas Cowboys. And the catch was, we talk about clutch all the time in basketball. And I don't know if we talked about clutch in regard to football, especially back then. It's much more of a modern talking point, but that was one of the most just dramatic clutch plays I'd ever seen. And I'm 13 at the time. People can start doing the math. And so to me, that was the most exciting moment of my sports fandom at that point. I remember where I was, who I was with. And that season and that moment, which then leads to the Niners' first Super Bowl, kind of gets me down that path. That's the year that everything changes for me in terms of my interest in the sport, or taking my interest to a different level and making a religious campaign of devouring the Mercury News sports section every morning. Like that became my thing. And as again, that was not the usual in my family. It was no problem. I didn't have to fight for the sports section as a kid. Nobody else was grabbing the sports section in my family. So, but that's what kind of launches me on this path that I don't think my parents or anybody else saw coming.
Well, it's kind of funny, right? Because neither did I. Like my mom is not into sports at all. Neither is my older sister. And so as a kid, I grew up again on the East Coast. Growing up in Connecticut, we have the New York papers down here, the Post, the Daily News. I grew up reading Mike Lupica. I grew up reading Joel Sherman and Ken Davidoff in the New York Post, because that was my thing. And it was a variety of things as well. I mean, I lived and died at the time with, my teams were the Yankees, the Knicks, the Giants, and the Rangers. So I lived and died at the times with Jaromir Jagr at the Garden, Henrik Lundqvist, Derek Jeter, and A-Rod on the Yankees. And I was the only kid in the house that really cared about any of it. Sometimes my mom would look at me, and she still does, even though I've toned it down over the years, like I'm a maniac because of how intense I would get for these games. And yeah, it's isn't it funny that we can trace it back to those moments, and it all begins, at least our love of writing. I'm a writer as well, not on the level that you are. I write here and there. It begins with devouring that back page. It doesn't matter the paper. We just love to read about it.
Yeah. And so I always keep that moment in mind for me, because when you get older in this business and get jaded as we do, as I certainly have, I don't have the same emotional attachment, and I have almost zero emotional attachment to the sport that I cover, or any other sport for that matter. It's just that's not the way I'm wired anymore. And it hasn't been for a very long time. I say this all the time, because people will say, "Oh, you hate this team or this team," whatever. I'm like, I don't care. I don't. I'm profoundly indifferent. I have not left a basketball game that I have covered happy, sad, angry, frustrated. I have had no emotions other than I'm off deadline. I'm done for the night. Or after the finals are over, okay, another season behind me. I can go spend more time with my family. Or occasionally if there was a team I was covering and they get eliminated, then it's like, yes, I'm done. Because like you're tired by the end. Like it's
right. Yeah.
So I don't have those emotional attachments anymore. But what I always remind myself of in this business is how much, and I need that reminder sometimes, how much it drives people, how invested people are emotionally, how much joy it can bring, also how much sadness it can bring, anger, a lot of irrational anger,
Yes.
vitriol, especially on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
But I get it. I mean, I don't know what I would have been like if I were the passionate Niners fan that I was in the 80s and 90s. If social media existed then, would I be one of these, maniacs screaming at random writers and stuff on Twitter? Maybe I would. I don't think so. I think sports fandom has gone off into some really unfortunate areas in the age of social media. But the Montana to Clark being this moment that I think redirected my entire life and that sparked this passion that brought me so much joy and Niners fans so much joy. I analogized it years later to Kobe to Shaq. I covered the Lakers for 7 years from 97 to 2004, and Kobe to Shaq launches their dynasty. It is a really almost perfect analogy to Montana to Clark for a different team in a different era and a different set of fans. And I thought at that time, not in the moment, but maybe in the days after, like for a bunch of kids who were just getting to know basketball, just getting to know the Lakers, LA fans in particular, right? That would have had the same amazing impact on them that Montana to Clark did for me. And those moments happen now and then, right? And
right, yeah, of course.
It's important to kind of recognize them for what they are, because it really does. It can have a profound impact on fans and on kids.
Yeah, of course. And I'm glad you pointed out growing up and kind of maturing, because I sent you a piece I wrote a while ago, falling out of love with fanaticism. I've had that moment. I'm 21 years old now, so that edge, I've kind of taken a step back. And it's funny, the Yankees were playing yesterday and I forgot. I'm like, okay, I'll just catch the highlights later. Like I didn't center my day around it anymore. You kind of grow up and you still like it. I mean, we both still like it, but we don't live and die by it. Like we used to. But when you're at that age, when you're 13, 14 years old, absolutely. And we'll talk about those Lakers years more in a little bit. We're talking with Howard Beck of Sports Illustrated here in the Mike Deneen Podcast, episode 68. Howard, nice enough to rejoin us here in the show. So you attended and graduated the University of California. And during your time there, what would you say was the most important piece of advice that you not only learned about writing, but also about the real world?
Oh, man. So I spent all my entire college career working for the California Aggie, which is the student newspaper at UC Davis, which is a completely student-run paper. We had no advisor and no journalism department. So it was students teaching each other, essentially. The seniors are teaching the freshmen. And we had our own style book. We had an ethics guide. We had, it was just knowledge passed down, basically. And there was a campus media board, which is an advisory body that the editor-in-chief of the paper, which I was my last year, meets with occasionally, but that board did not have any direct oversight over the paper's day-to-day at all. They both mostly were there for budget and in case any controversies popped up. So we really were just learning from each other. And that has its pluses and minuses. I never had a journalism professor who could serve as a mentor. I never had classes to teach about interviewing techniques or different writing styles, or how to file a freedom of information request, or anything. Like there's First Amendment law, all the things that a journalism major or somebody who gets a graduate degree in journalism might learn about in the classroom, I did not have. That's not unusual, by the way. There was a stat, I don't know what the stat is today. The stat 30 years ago was that if you polled newspaper journalists, which would have been the dominant grouping at that point in media, like 60% had a journalism degree of some sort, and I think 40% were like me and did not. Maybe it was flipped. Anyway, I learned a ton. But I don't know that there was any one piece of advice or any one person who was the most influential. It's just, you're just kind of learning as you go. And I was fortunate enough I think after my sophomore year of college, the Sacramento Union, a newspaper that no longer exists, sadly, rest in peace, Sacramento Union. The sports editor calls me out of the blue I'd been the sports editor at that point for the college paper. And he says, hey, I need somebody to fill in on a full-time basis this summer. So it was not an internship. This was like a job offer basically for the summer months. And I went and I worked at the Sacramento Union, where I did what we called agate. Agate is the scoreboard page, where I would just be coding up on these ancient ass computers, coding up the stats like box scores and standings and horse racing results and all this stuff. And while I was doing that, making decent money for a college student at that time, then the opportunity came up a couple of times. It's like, hey, do you want to go cover something? Like, we've got this beach volleyball tournament. Like the beach volleyball tournament had just started back then. Beach volleyball tournament, go down to, yes, no, by the way, for anybody who's curious, no, there is no beach in Sacramento. Sacramento's nowhere near the ocean. They dumped a bunch of sand. I think it was Discovery Park along like either the Sacramento River, the American River, one of their rivers. And they created beach volleyball. So I went and covered some beach volleyball, and I covered like the earliest version of the Arena Football League. And I covered some amateur boxing, which was horrifying because I'm very much anti-boxing, and I'm not like violent sports. Don't like, I can't, it's not for me. Sitting ringside with sweat and blood, like splattering on my notepad, not an experience I really wanted. So I just learned a ton by just doing, and I'm sure there was some good advice along the way. And if any of it pops back into my head while we're talking, I'll come back to it. But I don't think there's any one thing. I will say this. One thing I knew early on, realized, or maybe somebody told me, the only way to be good at this job or to progress as a writer, especially as a journalist, was to just do it a ton, because we all got a lot of really bad leads in us, lead being the lead paragraph. Got a lot of bad leads in us. We got a lot of bad stories, a lot of bad writing, a lot of bad cliches, dumb, not like just little tricks that you think are clever at the time. These little, phrase turns of phrase or something. And then you realize later, no, that's been done a bazillion times. It's not original. It's not good. So you just got to learn by doing and get a lot of the bad stuff out of your system. And the other thing that you learn early on is, find the people whose work you love the most. For me, that was in fact Sports Illustrated back then, and read it a ton. Read all the best writers by your own, through your, by your own, whatever your own taste is. And it's not that you copy what they do, but you try to emulate it on some level, or see what worked and what didn't work. And that's it. Like like in this business, there's no substitute for experience, whether that's interviewing techniques, whether that's, writing style, whether that's becoming more concise in the way you write a story. All of it is just repetition. It is the most important thing, I think.
Yeah, it's something that I think applies to all aspects of life. I mean, you kind of learn as you go, and there's moments where maybe you don't do the best job, but you learn from that. I mean, I've had moments like that. I'll listen back to earlier episodes of this podcast, and I'll be like, this, but that's just me being, me in my self-critical ways. But the point is to learn, and each episode, or for example, if you're a podcaster, each episode you get better, you gain more confidence. Each column you write, if you're a writer, you get more confidence because you're learning as you go. So that's definitely an important thing that you mentioned. So if I'm not mistaken, staff writer at the Davis Enterprises in 1991. Am I correct?
Yeah, so I worked for the Davis Enterprise from 91 to 95.
Yes.
Part of that time covering sports, and part of that time covering City Hall.
Okay. So that's interesting because, reporters covering City Hall, that's a job that, especially in recent times, is really an interesting, like if you have covering the mayor of, for example, a city like New York, you live in the city, he's a polarizing guy, we'll leave it at that. The mayor of Chicago, mayor of LA, anywhere you go, especially these large cities, not that Davis is that large, but still it's an interesting job because City Hall is essentially the lifeblood of any city or town that it is in, because that's where the decisions come from. And that's where ultimately things that affect the city or the town for the positive or the negative emanate from. So how has that experience affected you in any way as a writer? And what was it like doing something so drastically different than sports?
So the reason I ended up covering Davis City Hall for the Davis Enterprise was that I'd also done it at the California Aggie, the student paper. So I went to UC Davis, which is in the town of Davis, about 60,000 population at the time, counting the student population. And the reason was that when I got I have to back up. When I got to college, I wanted to be a sports writer. That's why I walked into the college newspaper on like day one of orientation week and said, hire me, go send me to do something. And my first assignment actually was covering the UCD men's cross country team, appropriately enough, having been a cross country runner in high school. So I did that. And after 2 years of being full-time at the student paper, covering sports, variety of sports, I did football, did basketball, wrestling, all kinds of stuff. I just kind of got the journalism bug more. It became about more than just sports. And I wanted to do different things. I wanted to do more. And so I moved over to the city desk and started covering City Hall, and eventually became the city news editor and eventually the editor in chief of the paper. And so by the time I graduated, I didn't have a set path at that point. Sports is what got me through that door and what put me on that path. But I actually, by that point, had enough of an interest and enough of a just kind of an internal debate too, right? Like, sports is fun, but sports doesn't matter. That's what I was telling myself at various times early in my career. Sports doesn't matter, right? The news is what matters, right? What was going on in the city of Davis, what was going on campus, what's going on in the world at large, like, that's what matters. And so there was a certain point where I thought, and especially once I started at the Davis Enterprise covering local sports, I was covering either more UC Davis sports or Davis High School. And there's a certain point where you think, like, it's not even like covering I was never really into covering high school sports. High school sports is a great way to learn, and I recommend it for anybody. It is a great way to cut your teeth and get a ton of reps and deadline experience. And it's challenging in all kinds of other ways. You have to keep all your own stats. It's great experience. But there was a part of me that was like, what am I doing spending all my time quoting, like, 15-year-old field hockey players or whatever else we were doing at the time? And so I always had a little bit of a conflict of is sports matter enough, even at the highest level, even if it was covering the Niners or covering the NBA as I do now. So for a while there, I thought I want to do something else. And so when I was at the Davis Enterprise, after about a year and a half, 2 years of covering local sports, I jumped over to City Hall. So now I was covering the city council again, something I'd already done in college. I had a familiarity there. I thought I was pretty good at it. And to your question, it teaches you a lot because, I wasn't just covering City Hall. Something would happen, and not that there was a lot of police activity in sleepy Davis, California, but occasionally I'd get pulled into something else, right? I remember covering somebody was threatening to jump off of one of the academic buildings on campus. So I covered this suicide watch situation. I covered some fires, and when I went to the Ventura County Star later, I spent a couple of years there covering news. And again, you get pulled into some things, covering a house fire, covering just, political rallies, all kinds of stuff. I think it just, given that sports is never just about the sports, right? You cover basketball. You don't just cover basketball. There are controversies that arise. There's collective bargaining issues that arise. There's drug testing issues. There's, stadium funding issues. There's all these other things where, sports is never just about sports. And we've seen in the last year, especially, right? Black Lives Matter became as embedded into the sports landscape as anything, outside of sports has in my lifetime. And so the better you are at navigating things outside of sports, navigating issues, navigating, finding the right sources and experts on various things, understanding how local politics works for that matter, understanding something about grassroots activism, all these things that I covered in spurts earlier in my career, I think just kind of hones you as a reporter, because it's just a really important thing, I think, to stress too. A lot of people these days, because there's such an easy entry using social media to start covering the game, you can just start writing, you can start blogging, and people create a career that way. But there's a difference between writing about basketball and being a reporter. And it's fine. There are different lanes. If some people just want to write essays about the game, or just want to analyze the stats, or just want to break down the X's and O's, that's fine. I'm not saying it's better, worse, or otherwise. It's just different. But I came up, a journalism route where understanding how to, report a story, ask the right questions, find the right experts, not considering myself an expert, but going to the experts. That's what journalism is about. And so to me, those early years covering news I think really sharpened a lot of those skills.
It was definitely a good thing, obviously, between the Ventura County Star, Ventura County a little bit bigger, obviously, than Davis. And that would serve you well for what would come in 1997, which is your assignment, not with the LA Times, but with the, as you said at the beginning, the Los Angeles Daily News. I want to make sure I don't get it wrong, which is, I definitely, I think quite a few people would say that's the biggest newspaper on the West Coast and certainly one of the biggest in the country. So this is a big opportunity to move up the ladder. How did it come about?
Yeah, and by the way, while we're quickly paused on the subject of the LA Daily News, other LA Daily News alums who are covering the NBA that your listeners would definitely know about,
Mm-hmm.
Mark Stein, who directly preceded me on the Laker beat, Gary Washburn at the Boston Globe,
yep.
Mark Spears at the Undefeated and ESPN, Ramona Shelburne at ESPN. In fact, I worked with Ramona, Gary, and Mark Spears. We were all there at the same time. I did not overlap with Mark Stein, but yeah, we've got a pretty nice alumni group there for the sleepy smaller paper in Los Angeles. So there's that saying about that luck is when preparation meets opportunity. First person I ever heard say that, by the way. If I remember this correctly, I'm pretty sure that the first time I ever heard that was Jim Soker, who was the legendary football coach at UC Davis, had said that I took his class. He had a football class. It was like a 1-unit class through the PE department to learn about his system, basically. Like you learned kind of like their playbook. It was really cool. But Jim Soker was a very philosophical kind of football coach and had a lot of things that he worked into his philosophy as a coach, including some Zen Buddhism and other stuff. And he was somebody who always had a lot of these truisms or sayings or idioms. And so I'm pretty sure he's the first one I ever heard say luck is when preparation meets opportunity. So in 1997, I'm working at the Ventura County Star. At that point, I've been covering news for 4 or 5 years, both in Davis and Ventura. I'm out of sports. I don't think I'm ever going back to sports at this stage, but a guy named Mike Anastasi, who had been the sports editor at the Davis Enterprise and had hired me at the Davis Enterprise years before. He's now the sports editor at the LA Daily News. I'm working at the Ventura County Star about, hour and a half north of LA. So I'm in the same region at this point. Mark Stein has left the Daily News to go to the Dallas Morning News to cover the Mavericks. So they have an opening on the Laker beat. And I'd still stayed in touch with Mike Anastasi over the years, but I had not had any real thoughts about going back to sports. But he calls me up one day and says, "Listen, we have an opening on the Lakers. You should interview for this. If you want to get back into sports, this would be a good opportunity." And then he said, "I'm not going to interview you because we've known each other a long time. We're friends on some level. I'm going to turn it over to the deputy sports editor and the assistant sports editor, the editor in chief, the managing editor of the paper. Like they'll do the interviews. I'm just getting you through the door. But if you're interested, this would be a good opportunity." I actually kind of debated it for a bit, which sounds ludicrous now. But I had a couple of friends actually say to me, "Are you insane? Why are you even thinking twice about this?" But it was because I'd kind of picked a new path at that point. I kind of had thought I put sports behind me and had decided, again, like, news is the important stuff, right? So, but yeah, my friends were right. I'd be insane not to pursue this. So I did. I interviewed with all those people I mentioned. They hired me, and, a couple months later, I'm interviewing Kobe Bryant at age 19 out in Palm Desert, where the Lakers are holding, preseason training camp when they used to go out there. So, yeah, I mean, huge thanks to Mike Anastasi for opening that door back then. But that's the luck is preparation meeting opportunity, right? Like it's not luck. Like that is also you could also say it's not who you know or not what you know, but who you know. There's a little bit of that too. But it's the work that I did with Mike in Davis that lets him know that I'm somebody who would fit for this, even if I'd been out of sports for a few years, even if the NBA wasn't my primary sport, even when I was doing sports. He knew what I was capable of. And look, there's a pretty good case to be made that was that I was not qualified. I hadn't covered the NBA before. I hadn't covered big time sports before. I hadn't even been covering sports, and I wasn't even at the LA Daily News. Like I was on some level, I was a reach. But I'd like to think I vindicated myself. Okay.
I think you did just fine, and you're probably, I mean, even though, as you said, sports and news at large kind of intersected in the last year, I'm not bashing these people. I'm just saying, covering what those that work. I mean, I know some of these reporters, a little bit behind the scenes, and I have a rapport with them. And I mean, you're just burnt out because it's a lot. It's a lot, and that's the thing that makes sports such a great distraction. I'm sure that you felt that at times. I mean, I've had people, for example, anybody that was in New York after 9/11. I mean, the Yankees run to the World Series, for example, was a great distraction from the real world. And sports at times, even though it's intersected with, as I just said, the news, at times it's still been that great distraction to kind of just decompress. So it is fun. It doesn't matter on a large scale, but it's more fun to cover that than it is the events that we've seen in recent times. So let's get to the Laker years. As you said, 97 to 2004, perfect timing, really, because even
Yeah.
even before the dynasty began in 2000, the seeds were being planted because the Lakers, it's not like the Lakers just boomed overnight. It's kind of like the Bulls. There was that slow build. They were good, but not good enough. They couldn't get past Utah for a little bit. They couldn't get past San Antonio. Then they broke through. So I don't think you weren't there for 96, 97. That was a little bit before. You were there. 97, 98
Right.
was the
Yeah.
first
So
season, right?
correct. Yeah. I got hired in, I think it was like May or June.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not really truly covering that. I did some off-season stuff, but I didn't really
Right.
truly get covering, get to them on a full-time daily basis until training camp opened in whatever, September or October of that year. And so, yeah, I missed Shaq and Kobe's first year together. They had a bumpy first year. That's, Kobe shooting all the air balls in the playoffs, but also
Yeah.
Shaq had missed a bunch of games with a knee injury.
Mm-hmm.
And so my first year covering them 97, 98 is Del Harris's last full year as coach. They make it to the Western Conference Finals and get smoked.
Utah.
Utah sweeps them in 98. And that's, things kind of just unfold from there, right? Then we go into a lockout. The lockout season is compressed, 50 games in 90 days. Del Harris gets fired early on. Kurt Rambis takes over. He finishes it out. They lose in the second round to the Rockets. They beat the Rockets, lost to the Spurs.
They got swept in the second round.
Again,
last
swept.
game of the Forum. Yeah.
Again, swept. Yeah. Yeah. And so, yeah, and right, you're right. And they close out the Forum. And then Phil Jackson gets hired. And so at that stage, Kobe's still going through early growing pains. He's still, I always have to remind people of this or tell people this because now that the audience is skewing young enough, they don't know. But when I first started covering the Lakers in 97, Kobe's second year, he's coming off the bench. And in 98 or the 99 season, the lockout season, he's still coming off the bench to start the year until they had a bunch of injuries that opened up a spot for him. And then he took over and he never went to the bench again.
Right.
But none of this was foregone. None of this was obvious. And then he wasn't a star from day one by any stretch. So, then the Lakers become a dynasty. Like I had no idea what I was walking into, to be honest.
I want to rewind it though, because 97, 98, and Dale Harris is kind of like Mark Jackson with Steve Kerr. And there was some baggage with Mark Jackson as to why he got let go by Golden State. I know that, but Mark Jackson, to his credit and being fair, helped plant the seeds there for that team to eventually blossom as it did under Kerr. And the same is kind of true to an extent with Dale Harris and Phil Jackson. Now, obviously, Phil Jackson was a proven commodity before he got to LA. He'd done some outstanding work with the Bulls, 6 titles in 8 years. But that 96, 97 Lakers squad, even with Shaq missing that time and Kobe not being quite developed yet, they still won 56 games. And they beat Portland in the first round and got knocked out by Utah in 5 games. And that game 5 was close, but Kobe shot those air balls, as you said. 97, 98, which was your first year there. It's Shaq's second season in LA, Kobe's second season overall. Harris is leading them, and they have Eldon Campbell, Eddie Jones, Nick Van Exel, Robert Horry, and Rick Fox. 61 games. They won 61 games that year. So this was a really good team that couldn't quite get over the hump. And obviously 99, the Spurs knocked them out on their way to the first championship, which involved my Knicks, so we don't have to talk about that. So the summer of 99, let's really hone in on Phil Jackson getting there. As I just said, proven commodity. The breakup of the breakup of the Bulls dynasty at the end of the 97-98 campaign is well publicized. Michael retires for the second time. Scottie gets traded. Steve Kerr goes to San Antonio. All these different guys find their way out of Chicago. And Phil, it was told to him, as we saw in The Last Dance, Jerry Krause says, Phil can go 82-0. He's not coming back. And so he's out of the game. And then comes this opportunity. When did the rumblings of Phil potentially coming to LA start? And just take me through that process from when those rumors did start to when he got there.
All right, so you were testing my memory greatly, Mike.
Sorry.
But no. I'll see if I can piece this together. I think I can. I think the rumbling started because Phil gave an interview to, I think, ESPN magazine, might have been SI. I think it was a cover story. Like he's got that 1 year sabbatical. I've got this image in my head of like Phil standing on a beach, maybe with his like shirt unbuttoned open, like with his hands in his pockets. I think that's the story. And I think in that story, he's musing aloud about Shaq and Kobe. Here he is. He's taken a year off. He's got his 6 championships. He's the greatest coach of all time, or he's up there with Auerbach, however people want to see it. And he's at that time, Phil Jackson, walks on air in NBA circles. And so he's just kicking it, taking a year off. And, somebody's doing a story about him taking his year off. And, he just happens to talk about Shaq and Kobe and what their potential would be if only they had the right, I don't know if he actually said he didn't say coaching, but, they needed something else. So he said just enough to, I think, kind of put the thought out there in people's heads that if he's coming back, if Phil Jackson's not truly retired, then this would possibly be the team. As you pointed out, Del Harris, they won 61 games with Del Harris in 97, 98.
He's a good coach.
And they got smoked by the Jazz because the Jazz were just this machine at that time with Malone and Stockton, and obviously really well coached, but a team that had been together a long time. Kobe wasn't really Kobe yet, and Shaq had some growing to do himself, frankly. And the Lakers, you went through the roster. It was a really deep group, but not all those guys are who you wouldn't have known at the time, right? Like Robert Horry had won a couple championships with Houston, but like Rick Fox was a good player, but he's not, we don't think of him the same way we think of him now, having won the 3 championships with the Lakers. Derek Fisher was like the 26th pick or whatever, and was looked at always as a guy who was too slow to guard other point guards. But now we think of him as just a 3-time champion. So the roster was, it was good. They won 61 games. Del Harris was doing a good job, but it wasn't a fully formed team yet, hadn't fully evolved yet. And, I think Del Harris would argue that if he'd been given the chance, they could have made those same leaps with him. That's his, it's understandable. He would see it that way.
Yeah, he has a fair, I think he has a fair grade. Yeah.
It's fair to the extent that Kobe had to go through those growing pains. Kobe had to learn how to play with his teammates. Kobe had to develop his body. There was a lot he had to do as a straight from high school player. And maybe he would have made all those same progressions. Maybe Shaq would have figured out how best to mesh with Kobe overall, no matter who the coach was. But that would be the case Del would make. I think Shaq and Kobe would both have said it at various times. No, they needed Phil, and it's not, and no disrespect to Del. I think they thought of him fondly in some way, but they needed a firm hand. Shaq always wanted that. Shaq says it all the time that, having been brought up by his stepfather, the Sarge, like he needed that military kind of disciplinarian. He wanted somebody to hold him accountable. He wanted to be coached hard. He wanted somebody to call him out. Kobe certainly, as a really young, star coming into his own, needed, somebody that he absolutely respected, and had the gravitas and the credibility that came with being Michael Jordan's coach through 6 championships. Like that matters. That matters.
Of course, absolutely.
And I think, you alluded to Mark Jackson, to Steve Kerr, right? Mark Jackson did a great job getting them to where they were, a 50+ win team with a top 10 defense. But the offense was kind of stagnant, and they needed some other voice, some other philosophy to kind of unlock the rest of it. And so that just happens sometimes. It's not a shot or a knock on the prior coach. Sometimes you just need a different voice and a different approach to take a team from point A to point B, or to take the next leap.
Right. And I go back to the Yankee example. Buck Showalter, great manager, obviously, great career in baseball, gets fired after the 95 season, had taken the Yankees to the playoffs. And then Joe Torre comes in and they win 4 championships and they have a great dynasty. So it's just like that sometimes. So I mean, those years, there was a lot of great moments, and I want to focus on two things. I mean, they had obviously those final series for the most part. The Pacers one was close. So, even though that game four could have went either way, and Kobe had one of his signature moments in that game four once Shaq fouled out. So that one went 6 against Reggie and Rick Smits. Rick Smits at the end of his career at that point. 2001, of course, AI has the great game one, and that's about it. The Lakers were the far superior team. They just blitzkrieged everybody in that postseason. And then 2002, I mean, New Jersey, it was a slaughter. But game 7 against Portland, I'm going to talk about two things. The first thing is game 7 against Portland in 2000. Were you at the Staples Center for that game? The infamous Brian and Shaq game?
Yeah, of course.
Take me through it, please. I need to hear this.
So I wrote an entire oral history about this for Bleacher Report last year when I was still there, about the lob. And it was the 20th anniversary, 20th anniversary last June 1st, I think. So that was when the story ran. And so the Lakers at that point, you know what's in the backdrop now, right? Swept in 2 straight postseasons, Jazz and Spurs. It's Phil Jackson's first year. The context for Phil Jackson's first year was Phil coming in saying the triangle takes a while for guys to master. Year one's going to be a little bumpy. Expectations shouldn't be that high. And we all bought it. Like, and if you go back and you look at all the previews in 99, newspapers, magazines, everybody, some people picked the Lakers to come out of the West, but more picked the Trailblazers, the Spurs, and the Trailblazers were stacked, and the Spurs were the defending champions. The Jazz was still really good. So like there were other teams that were getting a lot more buzz, or not a lot more buzz, but more had more belief than the Lakers because they'd been swept 2 straight postseasons, and Kobe was still like just kind of figuring things out. And it's year 1 under Phil Jackson, and he's bringing in an ancient Ron Harper to kind of help prop them up and teach them the triangle. So the Lakers get to the conference finals against the Trailblazers, who are basically too deep at every position. They could sub out their entire starting 5 for a new starting 5, and it would be starting caliber. That's how good they were.
Yeah.
And this is a team with Damon Stoudemire at point guard and Arvydas Sabonis at center, Rasheed Wallace, who was just a beast back then, Steve Smith, Scottie Pippen, Detlef Schrempf, a young Jermaine O'Neal who's not even playing at that stage because they've got so much depth up front. Brian Grant. It's a really good team and a really deep team. And the one thing with the Lakers, the way I always describe it to people is this. We used to do in newspapers these matchup graphics going into a playoff series. Who's got the advantage at each of the positions? And then usually like coach and like intangibles. And you do a check mark on which team, right? Yeah. So center, Lakers, Shaq, check. Shooting guard, Kobe, check. But although back then, I will say it wasn't a given. Bonzi Wells is the other guy they had back then too.
I was going to mention him.
Physical shooting guard. Kobe couldn't guard Bonzi. But all right, say the check marks go to Shaq and Kobe, but the check marks at every other position were going to the other team, and in this case, the Trailblazers. Coach Phil was going to get the check mark over Rick Adelman. Over Mike Dunleavy. And Rick Adelman would have been 2 years later when they were playing the
which is the other thing,
finals,
the rivalry with the Kings. I'm going to ask you about in a moment. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and a quick aside, I point this out all the time. They win 3 in a row. They're a dynasty. They're the last 3-peat team that we've seen, but they are just a hair away from being a one-time champion instead of 3, because it took game 7 and a huge comeback in 2000 against Portland. And they go to overtime of game 7 against the Kings in 2002. And that was, of course, after the infamous game 6 with all the fouls, Shaq going to the foul line a bazillion times. So they're that close to being a one-time champ instead of 3. So 2000, they're going back and forth with the Trailblazers. It's a tough series. It's a nasty series. There's a lot of stuff going on, stuff being said and texts and flagrants and a suspension and all kinds of stuff. They get to game 7 at Staples Center. The Blazers are up 15 early in the fourth quarter. It's 15 with like 10, 20 something to go in the game. Like, I think it's over. By the way, a 15-point lead in the fourth quarter back then would be like a 25-point lead now. I don't think the math is actually correct there. It's probably more like 18. But
this
it
is before the
felt like a
three-point
lot
shot
more
became
than
all the rage, you know?
before the 3-point shot was as common, but also the pace of the game was much slower in the early 2000s. So there weren't as many possessions. So a 15-point lead in the fourth quarter with 10 something to go is a pretty sizable advantage. But the Lakers are just chipping away, and you're starting to feel the momentum shift. And by the time Kobe to Shaq, that big lob happens, the signature play of that game, of that series, of that era.
Yeah.
By the time that happens, they already have the lead. That's the thing that gets forgotten. You think of that play, if you've ever seen the highlight, you think, well, either it must have been the play that put them ahead to stay or clinched it with seconds to go or whatever. But no, it was like there was still another 57 seconds to play or a minute and 6 seconds, something like that. And so it's but it's the dagger. It's this momentum. It's this moment. It's this holy crap, this thing is going to happen now. And if you were the Laker fans and the Lakers, the look on Shaq's face as his mouth is agape and his eyes are bugging out and he's pointing up in the stands and all that. Like that is the knowledge or the certainty at that moment. This is happening. We're going to the finals. And, it's not that, like the momentum had long since gone from the Trailblazers. They'd already blown the entire 15-point lead and were down by a couple points, but the game's still in reach technically. But that the emotion of that play, the impact of that play just completely changes it. So the Lakers win that. They go on, of course, beat the Pacers in 6 games in the finals. Kobe has that legendary overtime in game 4, as you noted, after Shaq had fouled out. And yeah, that was a wild run and just a thrill to be around. One quick anecdote about that game 7, when that was happening, when they're down 15, as a newspaper reporter on Deadline, you're already writing your story. So I'm writing a whole thing about, this great season. They won 67 games, great first year under Phil Jackson, but they couldn't quite overcome the Trailblazers at the end, blah, 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 whatever it was I was writing, it was going to be about a loss and about the season being over. And so as this they keep chipping away and you see this thing starting to shift, you're having to kind of like, modify. And then eventually it's, oh, holy bleep, this thing is going the other way. And you're writing a whole new lead entirely. But in that time span, in the fourth quarter, as this whole thing is turning around, what was also going through my head was, all right, season's over. I'll write a follow-up story tomorrow, maybe one more the next day. They'll have their locker clean out day. And then I'm done. I get to go on vacation or whatever, or at least be off until the draft or something. And I had one of my best friends was getting married the following week in the middle of nowhere in Nevada at a ranch. And the only way I was going to be able to get there was if the Lakers were out. So I'm like, yes, I get to go to Sean's wedding. And then all of a sudden, no, that's now game 1 of the finals in Indianapolis. Was that LA? No, it was
no, Los
LA.
Angeles. Because Lakers had the home
court.
court.
In LA. We did. Yeah, that's right. We started in LA. Maybe it was the following week and I had to be in Indianapolis for that, or maybe it was game 1. I think it was game 1. So it was going to be LA, but there was no way I was going to be able to I'm not taking game 1 of the finals off, and there was no way I was getting to the middle of Nevada and back in any case. So, that's one of those rough moments looking back where, great thing to be able to cover, great life experience, career experience. I did miss the wedding of one of my closest friends, and so that was a bummer.
Shout out to Sean. Hopefully he didn't mind.
He forgave me.
Yeah, that's good. We're talking with Howard Beck here on the Mike Tenium podcast. Howard coming back, making his return in episode 68 after originally being on 3 years ago in episode 10. So you know what? And before I get to the rivalry with Sacramento, if you think about it, because the score was 83-79, and I'm picturing the play in my head, symbolically, that was kind of a passing of the torch because who was guarding Kobe? I'm sure you remember as he prepared to do that alley-oop. Scottie Pippen. So here you have Scottie Pippen.
Yeah.
Now with the Blazers, but of course, not too far removed from his 6 championships with the Bulls. It's almost as if once Kobe crossed Scottie over and threw that lob to Shaq and Shaq hammered it down, that Scottie reluctantly in that moment, obviously wanting to win and continue his legacy apart from Michael, Scottie reluctantly passed the torch from his years and his dynasty with Chicago to this new dynasty that at that moment, looking back, was born. So it's kind of unique to think about it, especially, 20, 21 years later. So as I said, that rivalry with Sacramento was so, I mean, it was one-sided. The Lakers took all three series, and with the exception of 2001, most of them were pretty close. Sacramento took them the distance in 2000, the first round, although game five was just an absolute blowout. 2001, the Lakers swept them. Those games were mostly close, but the Lakers just were the better team. And then 2002 came that infamous game, 7-game series that was so great. I mean, Mike Bibby's heroics in game 5, Robert Horry's heroics in game 4, that controversial game 6, that great game 7. It's one of the nastier rivalries that the NBA has seen. And this is after Pacers, Knicks, Bulls, Knicks, the Heat and the Knicks. So take me through just covering that rivalry and the hatred that existed between those two teams.
Yeah, because I'm glad you brought it up, Mike, because I feel like rivalries are one of those things that have kind of like fallen by the wayside, maybe because of player movement, in this era. It's just harder to have, the bitterness build up or for teams to face each other year in, year out. But, they packed a lot into that, the 7 years that I covered the Lakers, and then they, the breakup of Shaq and Kobe coincides with when I left LA for New York in 2004. But in that 7-year run, the number of times that they played the Blazers, the number of times that they played the Kings, the number of times that they played the Spurs, like there were serious rivalries with all of those teams and their fan bases. Mm-hmm. And so it was always amped up. There was always more to it. Like you never just walked in and thought, okay, this is just another series. Like Lakers and Suns the one year, fine, whatever. But Lakers Spurs brought something out. Lakers Kings, Lakers Blazers, like those series were intense. Although after 2000, the next 2 times the Lakers played the Blazers, they swept them, and it was best of 5 first round. So it meant that those were very short 3-0 series. But the Kings was a whole other level. The Kings, like the Blazers, were deeper than the Lakers. Had a better, like not a better starting 5 because Shaq and Kobe tilts the scales so far one way, but it was the same thing. Center, Shaq, check. Kobe, shooting guard, Kobe, check. Power forward, Chris Webber, check. Point guard, Mike Bibby, check. Small forward, Peja Stojakovic, check. Although maybe a toss up with Rick Fox. Rick would argue the point, I'm sure. Mm-hmm. Turkoglu coming off the bench. They've got, behind Vlade, they've got Scott Pollard and some other bigs to hack Shaq. Doug Christie is one of the better defenders in the league to deal with Kobe. They were built to beat them, and they very nearly did. And there was a lot of bitterness there. You had Phil Jackson talking smack all the time. So at one point, one of those years against the Kings, he had referred to Sacramentans as redneck in some form or fashion, which is a very Phil phrasing. He loved saying in some form or fashion. He called them redneck in some form or fashion, and semi-civilized. And Arco Arena, which was their arena back then, it's this bandbox of an arena. The fans are right on top of the visiting bench, and therefore right on top of us too, because the press table was, back then we're always sitting courtside. Our seats were right next to the Laker bench. And so the fans that you would always hear about banging those cowbells, they're leaning right over the bench. Like they're hanging those things. Those are almost over their heads. They're that close, which meant they were that close to me also. So like we just had that stuff just ringing in our ears. Arco was loud as heck. That was one of the loudest arenas in the NBA for a long time. Those fans were as passionate as can be. They hated the Lakers, but everybody hated the Lakers. Like it's a funny thing being from Northern California originally, knowing how like in the Bay Area, you grow up hating everything about LA. You hate the Dodgers, hate the Lakers, hate everything about LA, glamour, Hollywood, all that stuff. And when I'm covering the Lakers, we're going around the country and everybody has that same feeling, right? Everybody resents the glitz of Hollywood and the Lakers, and they see them in a certain way. And especially for smaller towns that have a chip on their shoulder about it, like you ain't better than us, that kind of thing, right? Everybody's very provincial. And so the fan bases in places like Portland and Sacramento and San Antonio, smaller cities, definitely have that. So there's all this other stuff that feeds into it just from a fan perspective. And then Phil's talking smack, and there's Shaq's talking smack about the Kings, and Shaq's accusing Vlade of flopping, and Kobe elbows Mike Bibby in the nose at one point. there was just always just stuff happening. Rick Fox and Doug Christie were always getting into it. And of course, they infamously had a fight in a preseason game one year.
In the tunnel.
That's how bad it was. Like that's how things were different back then. Guys, the rivalry was so intense that guys were looking to throw down in a preseason game. So all of which is to say it was a blast. I loved it. The basketball was great. It was fun. The Kings were also, by the way, one of the most entertaining and most skilled teams of that era too. So I loved watching them. So all those Lakers Kings games I got to see, 4 games in the regular season every year, plus however many they would go in the playoffs each year. Those were some of my favorite games for sure.
And even before Mike Bibby, I mean, even though Mike Bibby was a superior player, White Chocolate, Jason Williams at point guard, he was definitely a flashy player, an exciting player for those Sacramento teams. So we'll wrap. I don't want to keep you too long. He was one of my favorite players. I don't want to keep you too long. We're coming up on about an hour here, and you're so generous with your time. So we'll wrap up with on the Lakers front. We'll get to the Knicks in a second. Well, on the Lakers front, we'll wrap up with that 03-04 squad. A lot has been written and said about that squad, and even Phil Jackson has talked about that squad. I mean, Karl Malone at the end of his career, still an effective player, although he battled injuries, unfortunately, during that 03-04 season. Gary Payton, again, still an effective player. And this is still Kobe and Shaq. They got off to a really bad start the previous year, but still came back and won 50 games. So now they go into 03-04. They take out a young Yao Ming in the Rockets. They take out the Spurs again, that controversial shot with Derek Fisher in Game 5. They get revenge for the Spurs knocking them out last year. And then they take out Kevin Garnett and the Timberwolves in the conference finals, and they're up against Detroit, this rugged, hardcore Detroit Pistons team. Rasheed Wallace in Portland. No love lost for LA, I'm sure, now in Detroit. Ben Wallace there too, no relation. Chauncey Billups, once a Knick, always a Knick, also there. Same can be said for Rasheed Wallace. And people are expecting at the time, the Lakers, the Pistons are a nice third, but the Lakers, they're going to take it. They should take it. They have this great duo. They have this super team. And then everything just comes undone. So that 03-04 squad, which was the last that you would cover before coming East Coast side, take me through covering that and just what the heck went wrong in that finals?
I mean, there's a lot that goes into it, but I'll start with this. Shaq and Kobe by that point wanted nothing to do with each other. It was so clear. Shaq had said to me at one point earlier in the season, it was late in the season, sometime between the All-Star break and playoffs, Shaq had said to me one day, just off the record, they're going to trade me. He's like, he just felt it. He knew it. And of course they ultimately did to Miami in that offseason. Kobe was agitating. He was saying a lot of stuff behind the scenes. He was threatening to leave. He had an option to opt out. He was going to opt out. And he was talking about leaving, and he was possibly going to go to the Clippers. And the Clippers had cleared the books to get him. They wanted to pair him with Elton Brand in that group. And so there was just a lot going on. Phil Jackson was on an expiring contract. Jerry Buss did not extend him. Shaq wanted an extension that he had made a lot of noise about in the preseason, and Buss had declined on the extension because he was worried about Shaq's health, and it was going to cost a ton. The luxury tax was just coming into play, or had just come into play back then. And so there were just a lot of things going on that were everything pointing toward, tension, discord, and the possibility of a breakup. So the chemistry was one thing. Gary Payton and Karl Malone had come in as, mercenaries, essentially as free agents the prior summer. And Gary Payton was definitely slowing down. Karl Malone was still a beast. Karl Malone was great. But Gary Payton was toward the end for him. And Gary Payton never truly embraced the triangle offense, right? Like that's just a prerequisite. You're coming to play for the Lakers. And Gary Payton was more of I'm going to handle the ball a lot, traditional, old school point guard. Didn't fit. And so he and Phil Jackson, there was that tension, not a personal tension, but just like, this is the way we play. And Gary Payton just never meshed with the triangle. But Karl Malone was the linchpin of that team. And Karl Malone was the one who was single-handedly, I think, keeping Kobe and Shaq from killing each other at times. And, there was a lot that went on. We don't need to go through all that, but early in the season, especially, and in the preseason. But Karl Malone, in a December game, I think it was, against the Phoenix Suns, Scott Williams falls into Malone's knee. So this wasn't like Karl Malone, he got old. They signed an older Karl Malone. No. Karl Malone was still kicking people's behinds. It was a freak accident. Scott Williams falls into him toward on the near the sideline. He tears his MCL. I think it even got misdiagnosed initially. Malone misses a huge chunk in the middle part of the season. And he was this really necessary kind of just glue guy, balancer. And, everybody respected Karl. No one's messing with Karl Malone, not Shaq, not Kobe, not anybody else. So without him playing every day, with him not being a part of it, I think it allowed things to fray that much more. By the time he comes back, now he isn't quite the same Karl Malone. And he has knee problems again in the finals. So, and eventually that I think took him out toward the end. You've got Slava Medvedenko trying to cover Rasheed Wallace. Like, Rasheed Wallace was one of the best power forwards of that era. His numbers don't tell you that, but ask anybody. He was as good as Kevin Garnett, Tim Duncan, Chris Webber, that whole era of great power forwards. Rasheed Wallace was as skilled as any of them. The guy was amazing. And the Lakers had no answer for him. Rick Fox was hurt. I think Devin George might have been hurt. They had an older Horace Grant who they'd brought back again. They just weren't equipped. And Kobe has Tayshaun Prince, who's an elite defender and really long, draped over him. And Kobe's, at that time, it was the worst shooting percentage of any playoff series he'd been in, was the 2004 finals. And a lot of it was him trying to jack up shots over Tayshaun Prince and others who were all over him, while Shaq was shooting 60% or whatever, and Kobe's blowing him off because they're already done with each other. So it's not to diminish. I've talked to Chauncey about this before. Like, I'm not shy about it. I think if not for Karl Malone being out, the Lakers still win that series. And it's not to discredit what the Pistons did. They were an amazing team. They had great defense. They did have that all for one mentality. They were the underdogs. They pulled off one of what will go down, I think, is still one of the great upsets in finals history based on what you saw on paper. Mm-hmm. But Malone wasn't Malone at that point. Payton wasn't Payton at that point. And Shaq and Kobe wanted nothing to do with each other. And the Lakers supporting cast was just fraying at the edges. So that's how it ends. A week later, I'm sitting on a curb outside the Lakers practice facility on a phone call with Shaq and two other reporters, as Shaq is telling us he wants out and he's demanding a trade. Of course, he knew he was going to get traded anyway. I think that was just his way of steering the narrative.
And so ends that. And I mean, that trade in hindsight, it worked out for everyone involved. I mean, Shaq would win another title with Dwayne Wade and the Miami Heat, that great 2006 Miami Heat squad. And Kobe won two more with Paul Gasol. He went through some rough stretches, 04 to 07, but I think it was best that they parted ways. And we'll talk a bit more about Kobe in a second. So if you can hear my lovely toy poodle making noise in the background downstairs, I apologize for that for all those listening. He's a spry pup.
Did not hear.
Oh, good. He's not coming through because I can hear him right now in the background. But so you go from really this, even though there was drama behind the scenes, especially towards the end, it was a great time to cover Lakers basketball. I mean, they were consistently good. There was always high expectations. And then you come to New York and it had really fallen off after 2000. I mean, after really Patrick Ewing was shipped out to Seattle and the Knicks are in the middle of a tailspin. We don't need to go through everything that happened because I have PTSD for most of it. But
also, we would be here a long time.
Yes, and which we don't want to be. 2004 to 2012. And I want to focus on that just period. We'll get to the last season, 12-13, which was actually fun in a moment. But that, I mean, you talked about it, I believe, in an article in the mid-2000s. It just, walking into the Garden during that time, it just sucked the life out of you. It really just sucked the life out of you. There was just nothing joyful about the franchise. It's one thing to be bad and still have some form of direction, as rebuilding teams do. But it's another to be bad and to be unwatchable and to be dysfunctional behind the scenes, which is what they were. So I don't know how else to ask this question, but that era of Knicks basketball, how did you survive it?
Yeah, it was not pleasant. Look, it's still covering the NBA, and it's still there were moments along the way, right? That first brief burst with Amari Stoudemire, the day that Amari puts on the hat and says the Knicks are back, baby. Yep. And his first few months with them, that was fun. Linsanity was a blast, of course. So there were some fun moments along the way. But yeah, I mean, look, I always say this, as beat writers, you're not emotionally invested in the team you cover. When they win, it doesn't make you happy. When they lose, it doesn't make you sad. It doesn't really matter to my day-to-day. I file my story, I go home, it's over. But being around a team that's winning a lot, it's obviously a happier environment. Although with the Lakers, never knew from day to day.
That was the exception to the rule.
There were times on the Laker. Yeah, no, listen, honest to goodness truth here. There were plenty of times in those 7 years I covered the Lakers, despite all that winning, despite all those, the 3 championships, 4 finals in 5 years, there were days that beat stressed me out so much I wanted to walk away from that beat, because it's just, sometimes it's just so intense. And the sniping, the feuding, it can wear on you. You're not involved. I have nothing at stake at the end, but you're living it through them every day, and you're around it, and you feel the tension, and you hear it, and you have to write about it, and it can be wearing. And so even covering a winning team, if it's winning and dysfunctional, as the Lakers often were, it can wear on you. The Knicks were losing and dysfunctional, and then sometimes historically bad and historically dysfunctional. And there was a sexual harassment lawsuit, and you had the team president and the coach and the star guard all feuding with each other. I mean, Isaiah to Larry Brown to Stephon Marbury to back to Larry to Isaiah, like the cross currents, especially for that period of time, it was just a mess. And so, yeah, it was. I don't know how to put it other than it was stressful at times, and it was exhausting. It was just exhausting. And there wasn't a lot of good basketball to offset that, right? Like, the fun of covering sports is that, you see some great stuff along the way. The saving grace for me was that in working for the New York Times, as soon as the Knicks were done, which usually meant as soon as the regular season was over, they'd send me off to go cover the playoffs. So I got to go cover the Steve Nash Suns. And I covered, like, I think there was a 1 year early on where I covered, Suns Mavs. So, it was Nash versus Nowitzki, and that was obviously a great series there, and some Spurs Mavs along the way. And I always covered the finals. So there was always other stuff to go cover, but for the regular season, the Knicks beat, it was tough. And also, as I mean, this is not breaking news here. The Knicks are not nearly as open as some other teams in terms of covering them. They have a lot more rules. They make it a lot tougher. And so it's less enjoyable when you can't really build up a good rapport with players and stuff, because the Knicks overmanage everything. And that continues to this day, unfortunately. And they do themselves a great disservice, because, right now the Knicks beat should be producing, like, great in-depth stories about Julius Randle and Emmanuel Quickley and RJ Barrett and the breakthroughs they're having. And it's not that the Knicks beat writers haven't written stories along those lines. They have. There would be richer, better stories partially it's the pandemic too, let's be clear. Mm-hmm. Zoom interviews are not the best way to get anybody, but the Knicks remain a very closed organization. And what that does is it inhibits the writers who are there every day from developing the kind of relationships and the rapport that lead to more informed and richer stories. And you need access to guys to really be able to get deeper. And so during those years I was covering the Knicks, that's one of the things that I came up against, that the Lakers were pretty easygoing. It was, if I needed Rick Fox, if I needed Derek Fisher, if I needed Kobe or Shaq, I just asked them. And so, that there was a bit of a shock to the system there too, where I had to kind of adjust to, like, okay, things are a lot more regimented here and a lot more limited. How do I find a way to still do interesting, meaningful, gratifying work with a different set of rules here? So you figure that out, you navigate it. I still did some great stories along the way, I think, but yeah, it's just different. It's just different.
And even with the Rangers too, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a Rangers fan, and I get that they don't want to do too many press conferences, because what are you going to hear? I understand people who say, what are you going to hear besides the usual cliches? But the Rangers are in the midst. They're one of the more young, exciting teams in the league. And for all you hockey fans listening to this, I mean, they have Buchnevich and Zibanejad, Panarin, Shesterkin, Adam Fox, Kako Lafreniere, and they're a really exciting team. And yet you don't hear too much from them. I mean, granted, the less press releases we see from James Dolan, the better. There's that flip side. But still, I get what you're saying, and we'll see how things shape up post-pandemic once reporters are allowed to go into locker rooms again. So a couple more things, and then I'll get you out of here. And I can't thank you enough for being on. You've been very generous. I do want to. One is somber. We'll get to in a second. One is actually pretty interesting, and I mentioned the 2012-2013 season. So this is really. We'll see what becomes of this season, which has been, for me as a Knicks fan, just so wonderful to see them finally turn that corner. But the best team that they've had to this point in this century has been 12-13, 54-28. They win their first Atlantic Division title since, I believe, 2000 or 97, whatever it might have been. I'm not sure. But it had been a while. So they win their division. They have a great run. But at the same time, if this is going on, the New Jersey Nets become the Brooklyn Nets, and they make the playoffs in their first season. They win 49 games. So that season between the Knicks resurging and taking that step after a couple playoff berths, the first round exits, and New Jersey becoming Brooklyn, you were still at the Times then. So what was that season like from your perspective?
The Nets moving to Brooklyn was a really big deal for New York sports and for New York sports media. So the sports editor at the Times said, listen, this is the first time Brooklyn's had a team since the Dodgers left.
Yep.
Why don't you go cover the Nets this year? Okay, cool. Like a change of scenery be good. I was living in Park Slope, Brooklyn at that time. Real easy commute. And sure, that sounds like it. And, after 8 years on the Knicks, change of scenery would be good. I mean, I only did 7 on the Lakers.
Yeah.
So 8 years on the Knicks, that was like, okay, cool. Let's get a change of scenery. Unfortunately, that Nets team was probably one of the most boring 49-win teams in NBA history. There was nothing like they had some star power, Darren Williams, Joe Johnson, Brooke Lopez. They won a lot of games. 49's a decent total, but there was never anything like particularly like, awe-inspiring about them or intimidating or really very interesting. I thought they were boring as heck. So I covered them the first 4 months or so, and that's fine. Like, again, it was fun. It's new. They're in Brooklyn for the first time. What's the crowd like? What's the just the vibe like? And it was all fine. 4 months into the season, it's clear that they are perfectly competent. The Nets, not particularly interesting. The fan support is okay, but not over the top. And by the way, the Knicks are having this breakthrough year. Howard, why don't you go back and pick up the Knicks? Which the timing was actually great because my first day back on the Knicks was the day that Steph Curry had that record-setting night at the Garden. Yeah. Not great to see for the Knicks, but like that was because that was my first day back on the Knicks beat. I got to watch Steph go off that night.
The Knicks won, though. Let me just add that the Knicks did win that game. People forget.
Didn't Raymond Felton have a key?
He did. He had a block, and Melo had 37 in that game. Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was a good day to be coming back. And then the Knicks have that great run. They finish. What did they win? Their last 11, their last 12 or something. That the final kick, and then losing in the second round to the Pacers. Roy Hibbert swats Melo. That Knicks team. That was a really fun team. The way they were constructed, but so much of it was happenstance. Amari goes down, so now Woodson's forced to play Carmelo at the 4, which was definitely where he should be, but that's not what Woodson would have done otherwise, and it's not where Melo wanted to be otherwise. They have to shuffle things around, and they don't want to start JR, so they want to keep him as a 6th man, so they don't have a shooting guard, so they're playing 2 point guards all the time, either Kidd and Prigioni, or was it Kidd and Felton earlier in the season?
It was.
Anyway,
I lived and died during that season. I remember it well.
Yeah. They've got an older Kurt Thomas who gets hurt, an older Rasheed Wallace who gets hurt, an older Marcus Camby who gets hurt. Like, there was so much about it that was not sustainable or built to last. Career years from some guys. And so it was a fun ride, but you could see all along, like, this is not 54 wins on the way to 60. This is 54 wins on the way to something probably less the next year. And, a lot of other things go into that, but it was that was a fun ride, and that was a fun playoff run, and it's actually still stunning to believe. Like, I have to be reminded of this, that it's actually that was the last playoff berth. Like, I thought, because I'm off the beat after that, and I'm covering just the league at large for Bleacher Report, and so at that point, you kind of lose track a little bit. I thought, oh, wasn't there another playoff run? And they're like, no, there were no other playoff. Like, it's hard to believe it's actually been that long. And here they are. They're in position to, certainly in position to, and looks like they will end the drought. The 3 longest droughts in the NBA right now from the playoffs: Sacramento, Phoenix, and the Knicks. Phoenix is definitely ending it. The Knicks look like they will probably end it. The Kings Still, still in play for a play-in game, I guess. Although the play-in, I want to point this out, the play-in game is not a playoff game. If you don't make it out of the play-in to the playoffs, you have not ended your drought, Sacramento.
And it's like kind of like in baseball, we have the wild card game. That's not the playoffs to me. They say it's they say it's the postseason. If you don't win that game, you just played an extra game added to an 162. It's game 163 basically.
Well,
to me.
Yeah, and I'll be clear, like this is not my judgment. I'm not saying this is how I view it. This is how the NBA views it. The play-in games are not the playoffs, and the teams. If you're in the play-on, excuse me, if you're in the play-in, but you lose and don't make the playoffs, you're still in the lottery. So and the stats don't count in the postseason stats. So it very, very much by NBA definition, the play-in is not the playoffs. So
let me just point out De'Aaron Fox. Let me just point out De'Aaron Fox mocked the Knicks on Twitter previously, so I'm very much enjoying their downfall, very much, So we'll see what happens with them. I actually feel bad for him. He's in a tough spot over there. So the second thing, let's hit on it and let's just get it out of the way. Kobe, you had a lot of interactions with him through the years. You saw him really from the beginning. Right on through the end of his career. And you weren't always in LA. Obviously, you moved around, but I'm sure anytime Kobe would come to the Garden during the Knicks years and just covering the league at league-wide after 2013, you saw him a lot. He's the one that coined the phrase, "What up, Beck?" That's why Zach Lowe says it every time you go in the low post. You had a great relationship with him. The day that he died and the aftermath of his death and the fact that so many other people died with him, that terrible helicopter crash, just take me through that day when you heard and just the emotions you felt.
Yeah. I mean, I'll try to give you just the short version. I was sitting at this exact spot where I am right now talking to you at my desk at home here in Brooklyn. And, Sunday afternoon scrolling Twitter as usual, as I shouldn't be. And I don't remember what tweet was the first one that I saw, but TMZ was the one that broke this. And so I don't know if it was a retweet or somebody else saying TMZ is reporting that, Kobe Bryant has died in a helicopter crash. And my first reaction, I think, was the same as everybody's, which is, all right, that can't be, that doesn't sound right. I know TMZ, specializes in this kind of stuff and they're not usually wrong, but something doesn't sound right. One, Kobe dying in a helicopter crash sounds like some far-fetched thing that somebody would make up. So my first thought is this is some sort of hoax or somebody's idea of a really sick joke. And then the second thing you think is, well, maybe it's another Kobe Bryant. So the guy's been on Earth long enough that other people could have named their kids after him and they could have had the last name Bryant. It's got to be something else. It does not compute. I cannot process this at all. So I'm in disbelief and maybe denial for quite a while there. And then, Twitter does what Twitter does, and this is building up and building up and building up, but I'm still waiting. I'm waiting for, I hate to say it, a legit organization. I'm not trusting TMZ. I'm waiting for the LA Times or CNN or, somebody, local TV affiliates, somebody to report the same. And I don't remember which was the first to confirm it. It might've been the LA Times. And then all of a sudden it sinks in that this is real. And I just kind of gasped and fell into my chair here. And my wife and daughter were out at the time. I can't remember what they were doing, but they came home. And I think when I first kind of started to just break down myself was telling them what had happened. And it felt like it got worse by the minute, because then you find out how many other people were on board. And then you find out that Gigi was on board. My daughter is not that much older than Gigi. And so, that was, for me, the progression from disbelief, denial, hope that it's wrong, to just the utter shock and emotional devastation of it. And then somewhere along the way, there's the realization that eventually your editor is going to start calling and saying you need to write. And it is, I've written, I don't know, thousands of bylines in my career. And that was by far and probably always will be the hardest thing I ever had to write.
It's one of those where were you moments for me. I told this to Rebecca Harlow, the great Knicks sideline reporter who was on the show a few episodes ago. I was a baby when 9/11 occurred. So the where were you moments in my life are the day Michael Jackson died, the day of Sandy Hook here in Connecticut, the day of the Boston Marathon, and that day when Kobe died. I'll never forget where I was on those days. And just the same thing, looking through Twitter, it was Woj that confirmed it. And once he tweeted out, yeah, this is real. It's tough because he was my introduction to basketball on a basketball side. Obviously, there's the human aspect, which is far more important. But I started watching basketball in 2006. I caught the second half. Kobe played an exact 20 years. So I caught the exact second half of his career. And I was telling this to one of my best friends. He was really my introduction. And he was really one of my favorite players of any sport ever. And it's not the fact that he died. It's the way that he died. And obviously the tragic fact that so many others, including his daughter, died with him. So I wanted to ask you about that. I know it's tough, but given the fact that you saw him so up close and personal, not just as a player, but as a human being, I figured I'd ask you about that. So let's get off of that. Let's conclude. And now I've kept you long enough. We'll conclude with a segment of this podcast called Rapid Fire. It's, we'll end on a positive note, and it's 5 hit and run questions from me and 5 answers from you. Are you ready?
As ready as I'm going to be. Hit me.
Okay, so the first question here is, you've been an SI for a little bit now, 7 years at Bleacher Report, now at Sports Illustrated. You've accomplished a lot, but what would you say some of your goals are? What are some of your goals now going forward now that you're at SI?
Wow. I never know how to answer that question. You just want to keep getting better. I've been at this now for 30 years, 24 on the NBA. And, there are days where you feel like I hit it out of the park. Doesn't happen very often, by the way. And then there are days you think like, I was okay, or wasn't that great. But writing is one of those things where every time you do it, it's as if you've never done it before. It's always starting from scratch. It doesn't matter how many stories I've written. It's never just second nature. It is always kind of this struggle and this battle with yourself. And so, there are times where I thought I did something great, went back, read it later, wasn't as good. Sometimes there's stories that I didn't think were that great. I go back, read it a while later. I'm like, oh, actually, you know what? I actually am proud of that one. I'll allow myself to be happy about this story. And so I say all that to answer the question in this way. After that many bylines, that many years on the NBA in journalism period, you just want to know that there's still ways to keep getting better. New ways to tell a story, telling different kinds of stories. I didn't start podcasting until, 3-4 years ago. And so, I'm okay as a podcaster. I'm not the greatest talk show host, I don't think. I just want to keep getting better at that. So it's nah, you're doing great. For whatever I'm doing, these are on some level creative endeavors. And so there is no perfection. There is no mastering it. There is just trying to get better. And so that's the only goal for me.
Oh, for sure. Second, funniest basketball player you ever covered?
Funniest basketball player? Mm-hmm. Ooh, man.
Well, I was
Gary Payton was hilarious. Just never shuts up. No, and always something to say. Just smack talking all the time. I mean, Gary Payton was one of the all-time great smack talkers on the court, legendary for it. And in the locker room, pregame, postgame, whatever, he was always just yapping as well. But it was great. Like it was, he was a lot of fun. I was fortunate enough that my first couple of years covering the Lakers, Charles Barkley was still playing. So you learn early on that if the team you're covering is playing Charles's team, at that time the Rockets, you need to leave the pregame locker room of the Lakers to go to the Rockets pregame locker room, because Chuck is going to hold court for at least 15 minutes, and he's going to fill up your notebook. And you need this, because what we would write these pregame notebooks where before the game even starts, I have to write like what we call like 15 column inches of stuff. And Chuck would just fill it up. So I'd have all these great notes that I could just file and get that done early. Plus it was going to be, it was always going to be entertaining. So, I think Chuck, Gary Payton were probably the two funniest. Somebody else is going to end up coming to mind as soon as we shut down, but that's a pretty good list.
I would say so. Third, you've been in both, and you're currently living in one of them. Better basketball town, Los Angeles or New York City?
It's not a fair comparison, because the Lakers have won a bazillion championships and the Knicks haven't won one since 1973. And so to gauge like the intensity level or the passion, like it's there in both places. But one, in New York, you feel it more because we're all on top of each other. In LA, it's so spread out. So when the Lakers are really good, you see like these Laker flags on the cars all the time. I don't know if you've seen these. Like, so you'd be driving to the 405 and there'd be Laker flags everywhere flapping on all these cars. They're just different. I don't know how to compare the two, but I will say that Knicks fans, like I never had to see Laker fans go through the rough times, right? Like I left before they had those lean years post Kobe Shaq dynasty. And, when they're suffering through like the Smush Parker, I mean, they still had Kobe. So it's not like it was that bad off. I've seen a lot worse era in New York or lived here for a worse era. I never saw the equivalent in LA. So all I can say is, I don't know how LA fans would have handled it. Probably not very well, because like that's championship or bust there, period. Anything short of that, they're freaking out. Knicks fans have stuck with this team through everything, through all the controversy, all the dysfunction, all the embarrassment, all the stupidity that James Dolan has foisted upon the organization, the NBA, the fans, kicking out people for saying sell the team, which is something that he probably should actually do. Yes. Like Knicks fans have stuck with them through it all. And like some people on the outside might say, well, you're fools for sticking with it. Like, why would you still support this team that has just dragged you through all this and tortured you and played with your emotions? But like Knicks fans, and some have quit. Like I've watched this over time. I saw some bail out after Linsanity. I saw some, say, no, I'm rooting for the Nets now. Andrew Yang took up the Nets instead of the Knicks, although he still kind of like plays both sides a little bit. But, he's running for mayor. That's what you do. Yeah. But no, nothing but admiration for Knicks fans for sticking it out, and so happy for Knicks fans. I was watching the other night, it was like Saturday night, I think, and scrolling through my timeline, because I have a lot of Knicks fans in my timeline that I'm following, friends, people who I've encountered along the way, bloggers, others, and like just the utter joy and thrill of this season, and especially this current winning streak. It's great. And it goes back to something we talked about earlier in the show, which is, sometimes you have to remind yourself of why sports are so great. The way it can just light you up and bring such joy to people. So that same feeling I had with the Niners back in the 80s, or that some young Laker fan had with, that Shaq to Kobe, or that Kobe to Shaq lob, and that Laker dynasty. Knicks fans have been through the worst of it. And so, this is wherever this season ends up, whatever comes next, the fact is, in this moment, they're bringing just incredible joy and gratitude to Knicks fans that is just long overdue.
It's organic.
Shout out to all my Knicks fan friends who are just having a great time right now. They deserve it.
And you mentioned Twitter. Add another Knicks fan to your list. I'll plug my Twitter handle in a second. Just saying. And it's organic. And not to go on too long, but that's the best part. 2012, 2013, it was kind of mercenaries for hire. A lot of those guys were older, as we covered earlier. This is something sustainable. Watching RJ Barrett's leap, watching, of course, Julius Randle after a really rough go of it in the first year in New York, take another leap, and a big leap at that in his career. Thibodeau's impact, the attention to detail, the attention to defense, which they hadn't played in years. I don't care if they go to the first round this year and get swept. This has just been, I think that this season is truly a stepping stone to better things to come. And it's about time, it's about time, because this city, baseball, it's divided, football, it's divided. Hockey, with the Islanders being around, it's kind of divided. The one thing we all get behind, though, even with Brooklyn being as good as they are, to their credit, is when the Knicks are good. And, we're finally having that. Fourth, what is one thing that somebody would be surprised to learn about you?
So what's one thing somebody would be surprised to learn about me? Probably that 520 mile I alluded to earlier. Other than that, I'm not sure there's anything that interesting. You
can say skip if you want.
Yeah, nothing else leaps to mind.
All right, that's fine. Fifth and finally, I mean, you, as you said, 30 years in business, accomplished a lot, done a lot, seen a lot. What advice would you give a young person looking to enter your profession?
Yeah, I mean, something else that I kind of mentioned earlier when you were asking about, my college years and learning to be a reporter or learn to be a journalist. I mean, the advice I always give, it seems so obvious, and it's probably the first thing that anybody in my position would tell them, but it's true. And it is the most fundamental thing. if you want to be a writer, you have to write a lot, and you have to constantly work at it, and you have to, and you have to read a lot, because chances are you're not going to be that good at it from day one. Occasionally I've seen somebody come along who was just like awesome, like on day one, came out of college ready to write for a major paper, recover a major beat, and were as good at 22 as I was at 32 or something, right? Like just, it happens. Most of us are not that good that soon. Most of us you have to grind through it. You have to get all the bad stuff out of your system. You have to constantly hone it. You have to constantly be your own worst critic, and reread your stuff and realize, what could have been better, what could have been said more concisely, better ways to structure the story. And then by reading the best out there, you see like the templates, like, oh, okay. Like I grew up reading SI when like Frank DeFord was in his heyday at SI, and like Ford is one of the most amazing writers, period, not just sports. And I will never be able to do what Frank DeFord did, but it gave me a sense of what sports writing could sound like, could make you feel. And, there were others as well. Mark Purdy, who was the longtime sports columnist for the San Jose Mercury News, was like my first sports writing hero as a kid. So you just read the people that whose stuff speaks to you, and try to find a way, figure out what it is about it that speaks to you, and then try to replicate that yourself. It's not copying it, it's emulating it. It's saying there's something here, there's a structure, there's a rhythm, there's a cadence, there's a way a story was put together, the kind of anecdotes that they got, and that's it. And then on the reporting side, it's the same thing too. You got to be curious, always be curious, and then feed your curiosity. Ask every question, and there are no dumb questions. Like we get this a lot now, all the gotcha of Twitter, people like punking anybody the second that something goes awry in a press conference or a player sneers or something. There's no bad questions, there's no dumb questions. Like there's just questions. You ask questions because you don't know the answer, and it's okay not to know the answer. That's the point of reporting. So I just say, always be curious, always be analytical, write as much as you can, read as much as you can, be your own worst critic. And if you can find other people to be a critic as well, or give you critiques of your work, do it, because we all need that.
Absolutely. Well said. So that concludes what has been a really nice episode of the Mike the New Haven podcast, episode 68. Nice to bring Howard Beck back on board. There you go. There's just a tongue twister there. Nice enough for him to rejoin us. So before we go, let's just plug ourselves. Howard, what do you want to promote?
Obviously, you can find my stuff at si.com. You can follow me on Twitter at Howard Beck. You can hear me on the Crossover podcast, which is every Tuesday and Friday. Tuesdays, where I co-host with Chris Mannix, and Fridays, where it's me solo with a guest. My first guests for that edition of the podcast were Tag Team, the Whoomp There It Is / Scoop There It Is guys. So that's up. You can find that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I have a story up today on si.com just about the play-in tournament and the quote-unquote unfairness of it, as the Mavericks had alluded to last week. So you can find my stuff there. And again, follow me on Twitter at Howard Beck.
All right. On LinkedIn, I am Mike Cologne. Just type in Mike Cologne, MIC' for the podcast, and you'll find me there if you want to connect. Twitter, Mike in New Haven, MIKEIN New Haven. And of course, as far as the podcast is concerned, anywhere that you get your podcast, all audio platforms, we are there. Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Google Podcast, wherever you want to get your podcast. The Mike the New Haven podcast is there. And of course, the video version of this podcast is on YouTube if you want to catch it there. The video version will be premiering tonight on my YouTube channel, MC's Audio, MC''S Audio, at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time if you want to catch it. And for those of you looking for the audio version, that will be dropping close to midnight tonight to hit the air tomorrow. So a great episode with Howard Beck. Thanks to him for coming on. And on behalf of Howard Beck, I am Mike Cologne, and we will see you next time.